Got 4 hours, maybe 3 hours of sleep last night, but this is my only day off to shoot this video, so we're gonna go for it. So today I wanted to introduce the topic of body language, and before we get into it, I wanted to give sort of a quick disclaimer that body language is really one of those things that takes a long time to learn. Don't expect to be watching this video and then being able to go out and read body language overnight. It's really one of those things that takes years and years of practice to become proficient at, and even when you are proficient, don't expect to be a mind reader. Everyone is different, and we can kind of take good guesses, and you'll become more accurate in your guesses over time, but you're never going to be able to know with certain what someone's thinking or feeling. You'll just have sort of better guesses than the average person. And maybe that's a little bit understated. It is definitely a very powerful tool once you become proficient at it, but it does take practice. So because it takes so much practice, this first video isn't actually going to be talking about what any sort of gestures or movements mean. Instead, I'm going to talk about how to get started with body language reading. Half the battle is being able to just see the movements, and trying to watch someone's body language at the same time as having a conversation with them can be pretty difficult. So I'm going to go through sort of the psychology first, the nerdy stuff about how we can alter the way we are sort of looking at the world to enhance our ability to sort of process body language at the same time as having a conversation. So the first piece of this is something called top-down and bottom-up processing. If you've taken any psychology classes or done much research on the topic of perception, you've probably heard about these before. They're very, very important to body language reading though. So just sort of a quick overview. I don't want this to be like a lecture by any means. Top-down processing is when we use sort of our previous knowledge to be able to perceive the world around us much faster. So an example of this could be like when you see a face, for example. You see a face, you immediately know it's a face. You don't have to see, alright, we have two little circles as eyes, we have sort of a triangular shape as a nose, we have an opening as a mouth. Okay, so I know that two eyes, nose, and mouth is a face, so therefore I'm looking at a face. That would be bottom-up processing, which is also important. Bottom-up processing, is when you take in sort of all of the pieces as a whole and then piece them together into what the object or whatever it is you're perceiving. Now, both of these processes, you know what I'm talking about. Anyways, both of these are very important in our ability to perceive the world around us. We use both of these every day of our lives. I wouldn't say one is more important than the other. They're both used in combination in order to more accurately perceive the world around us. In the case of body language reading, we already as humans are able to read body language fairly well at an unconscious level, right? You can walk into a room and see someone and you kind of get the vibe of how they're feeling. And this is more of a top-down processing that's happening unconsciously. Your brain kind of recognizes the movements they're making and you immediately know the answer. You're not looking at the person being, alright, well they have crossed arms, they're kind of slouched over, maybe they're not making eye contact or their eyes are closed. So you're thinking, alright, so we have this, 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 and this, which equals this. So it's very sort of mathematical in the way that bottom-up processing would work. And that's actually what we're going to be using for conscious body language reading. So you can think of it almost like a puzzle. We're going to be trying to observe someone, see all of the different movements they make, and then calculate sort of mathematically what it is they're thinking or feeling, whatever emotion they're displaying. Now, you may have guessed that bottom-up processing takes a little bit more processing power than top-down. It's not quite as automatic, especially when you're doing it consciously like you would have to when reading body language. So that kind of brings me to my next topic, which is our attentional resources of our working memory. When we're having a conversation with someone, most of our working memory, especially our phonological store, which is like our like words, conversation, is used up when just talking to the person. Even sort of your visual working memory is used up when you're trying to keep eye contact, maybe visualize what they're talking about. So this becomes increasingly difficult to maintain that conversation while trying to notice all of the little movements they're making and piece all of those together at the same time. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it's going to be very difficult when you first start doing this. It's not going to be an easy task whatsoever. Our attentional resources as humans are very limited, and there's not really anything we can do to increase them. However, there are things we can do to make them more efficient, and one of those things is practice. As you practice something, it requires less attentional resources to maintain that task at a proficient level. So in the case of body language reading, the more and more you practice it, the less of your attentional resources it's going to take up, and as a result you're going to be much more efficient at reading it. So the quick way of saying all of that without all the psychology lingo is that this is going to take a lot of practice, and it is definitely not going to be easy. So don't get disheartened, just keep practicing, and eventually you're going to become very, very good at it. So I've talked about why we need to use bottom-up processing when doing body language reading, simply because we need to make sure we are seeing each individual piece and then calculating the result. We don't want any of it to be happening automatic. As you practice, it might become more and more automatic, but it really is a sort of mathematical deduction. And if you're missing pieces, or if you're kind of getting lazy and allowing yourself to try to skip to the end result, that's when your accuracy is going to go down. However, bottom-up processing is not nearly as easy as it might sound. So I'm going to talk about how you can get better at consciously bottom-up processing more of the world around you. The easiest way to bottom-up process more is just be more observant of the world around you. I can tell you all of these special terms and explain it, but really what it comes down to is just being observant and aware of the world around you. For most of you though, that's probably not as in-depth of an explanation as you would have liked. So I'm going to give you some sort of tips and exercises that you can do to help yourself practice and get better at it. The first one is, what is the first one? The first one is to consciously take some time out of your day and observe the space that you're in. And it can be any space. What's important here is that you take 5 minutes or so out of your day and really take a deep look at the space around you. Maybe there's some nicks in your cabinet that you've never noticed before. Just go through every surface and really, really look at all the little deformities, the little nicks, maybe if something's really, really perfect looking. All of these little things are sort of clues about this object's past. And it's that sort of thought process of thinking through all the little pieces that's going to make you better at this bottom-up processing. Now that I think about it, I think I'm kind of overusing the term bottom-up processing. Deduction might be a better term in this case, although deduction does use bottom-up processing quite a bit. I think deduction's a little bit more accurate. So try to deduce why it is all of these little nicks and things exist. And if you do that, let's say 5 minutes 3 or 4 times a day, eventually you're going to start doing it unconsciously. And maybe not unconsciously, but you're going to be walking to work or driving to work, and you're going to see something, and then that thought process is going to start. It's going to trigger an idea of, oh, why is that the way it is? And that's what you want. You want to start looking at the world and questioning every little piece around you. Now this sounds very exhausting, and it is, I'm not going to lie to you, and body language reading is certainly not something for everyone. It does require a very acute awareness of the world around you at all times, and that can be very, very exhausting for a lot of people. Now that exercise helps a lot with your awareness and your ability to perceive the world around you, but we're talking specifically about body language reading. So I'm going to give you a couple more exercises to help you start becoming more aware of body language reading when you're having a conversation with someone. Because that's the most difficult, right? We're kind of distracted. while talking to someone, so it's difficult to have that conversation and be noticing all the movements they're making. The first one, I think the most easy, is to just start noticing the things that you're doing yourself. If you're feeling maybe sad or anxious, stop a moment and take note of all of your body language. If you're anxious or uncomfortable, maybe you kind of closed off, your arms are crossed, maybe you're kind of resting on your chin, maybe not making eye contact. Whatever it is, just kind of take note of what your body's doing. Don't try to explain it, just take note of it. If you want to start a journal and start writing some of these things down, like I was sad and I tended to cross my arms, or I tended to put my hands in my pockets. Things like that. And just start taking notice of yourself first, and that's often a much easier place to start than other people. Once you're comfortable sort of taking note of things that you're doing yourself, you can start moving on to other people when you're having conversations. And the important piece here is not to try to diagnose the movement. And what I mean by that is, don't try to say or think to yourself like, oh, their arms are crossed, so they must be feeling insecure or sad or in need of comfort. Just simply take note of the fact that they've crossed their arms. And you're going to want to do that with everything they do. And that's going to be pretty tricky at the start, and that's where your practice is going to come in. The more you do this, the better you're going to get, though. Purposely, I'm not talking about any definitions of gestures or movements in this video. It's simply how to start observing body language, because that's really where it starts. So many videos online talk about, they just give like those 10 quick body language facts, and I'd be willing to bet that the majority of you don't recognize any of them in your everyday conversation. Maybe once in a while, but it's definitely not something every day. As soon as someone does it, you immediately recognize that movement and then think of the definition. You have to learn to see all of the movements, and then you can start to memorize what all of them mean and sort of piece together thoughts and emotions that people are having. Lastly, the last sort of point I wanted to talk about is, when you start observing people, it can be sort of difficult to know what to look for and what's meaningful. And the short answer is everything, but that can be a kind of a difficult thing to just say, oh, look at everything they're doing. The things I'm going to be talking about later on, the movements, might seem obvious once I say it, but it's one of those things that it's obvious once you say it, but you've never really thought about it before. And it's sort of the same idea when you're trying to figure out what to look for. For example, like blink rate. I'd be willing to bet that most of you haven't taken note of how often someone's blinking before, but it's a fairly easy thing to notice. And so I'm going to give you just a couple things to watch out for that are super meaningful when we start looking at the definitions of things, so that way you're sort of prepared to be looking at the right places of the body. So I'm going to start off more obvious with arms. Arms are a great indication of how people are feeling. Again, I'm not going to give definitions of anything, but just take notice of what their hands are doing. If they're in their pockets, maybe their arms are crossed. If their arms are crossed, what are their finger positions? Are their thumbs up like this, or are they kind of hidden like this? Are they doing sort of a self-hug like this? Just arm position in general. Are they behind their head? Just take note of all of the arm positions. The next more obvious body movement is legs, right? Are their ankles crossed? How are they sitting? If they are sitting, if they're standing, what direction is their pelvis facing? Is it left or right? Is it facing towards someone, away from someone? Are their feet facing towards someone or away from someone? Next is the face. I'm not going to get into micro expressions in this video because that's something that's kind of difficult to spot, but simply eyes, pupil dilation, blink rate, gaze direction, how often they maintain eye contact is a really big one. 7 seconds is standard. If it's longer or less than 7 seconds on a consistent basis, that's something to take note of. I apologize if any of that was convoluted or didn't make sense. As I mentioned, I'm a little bit sleep deprived today. So I think that was all I wanted to cover. Yeah, so I appreciate you spending time with me, and have a great week.